Story 1. The journey to discovering the first body was even more exhausting than I anticipated. And according to the tapes that I'd found in the junk store, there were still 7 more out there, somewhere in the marsh. Who knows how far we'll have to go just to find the next one? I wondered, as I waited for the second cassette's audio to begin playing, if you're listening to this, you found the first body in the marsh. To find the second, simply take 5 steps north. The narrator began, his voice playing back from the cassette player and into my headphones, but upon waiting for further instructions, I only heard silence. Wait. What? I thought to myself, before the man continued. You're probably wondering how that could be possible. Well, the truth is, the body that you just found is part of a pair. A couple, to be precise. In this case, a very old couple, guilty of buying into a false dream. That, of lifelong companionship. An illusion of eternal love, knowing full well that we're all born alone and die alone. When you're ready to find the next body, switch over to the third tape, click. I pressed pause on the cassette player. There are 2 bodies here. That's when I remembered that Jess and Mike were still digging in the mud, a few feet from where we found the first body, in an attempt to find its clue, and completely unaware that there was another corpse beneath their feet. Wait. Stop. I called out to them, but it was too late. Seeing the remains of the second body, Jess screamed and stumbled back, while Mike, having just pulled a small wooden box out of the ground, suddenly dropped it and closed his eyes. Another one? He yelled out to me, yeah. According to the tapes, it was a couple. I explained, well, thanks for warning us. Jess added, I just played it now. I replied, well, did it say their names? Mike asked, their names? No. But it said they were very old. Okay, why do you ask? No reason. Mike replied, defensively, so what was the clue? Jess interjected. Mike picked up the wooden box that he had just unearthed from the burial site, opened it, and revealed a piece of paper, with nothing but the letter J written on it. What do you think it means? I asked. It's just one clue, idiot. Mike scoffed. It's too soon to say. More the reason we get to finding the others. What are the next instructions? I switched tape 2 for tape 3 and pressed play, click. You've made it to tape 3. Which means you've discovered the first 2 bodies. To find the next one, keep heading in the same direction you've been walking, and don't stop until you find the wreckage of an old boat. Lodged in the mud. Not far from it, you'll find the third body. When you do, switch to tape 4, click. We've been trudging through the marsh, navigating the fog with just a single flashlight, for what must have been another 20 minutes or so, when my Jess and Mike's banter began to wear on me. You know, with the election coming up in just a few days, I really wish I could vote. Jess said to Mike, why? He asked, 'cause then I could help change the world. That's not how it works. You'd vote for Clinton in an already blue state, so it would basically mean nothing. You're both wrong. I interrupted. The world doesn't change overnight, and her vote would matter. But none of us are old enough to vote anyway, so can we just drop dash? But before I could continue, Jess interjected, calling back to Mike and I from up ahead. Hey guys, we both looked over, to find her pointing to, of all things, a thick mist that was enveloping everything ahead of us, and rapidly closing in. Maybe we should head back after all. Jess backtracked. Yeah, you already found a second body, Mike. Now can we just go home? I insisted, but Mike wasn't having it. Sorry, losers. We gotta keep going. A vote's a vote. But we're almost there. And don't worry, a little fog's not gonna hurt nobody. That's when it hit me, Mike, back at the last couple we found. You had asked me if the tape had said their names? Yeah. So what? He replied, why is that? I told you. No reason, just be honest. Alright, fine. He said, before pausing for a moment, and then looking me in the eyes. I thought that maybe my dad was one of them. I knew it. I exclaimed, frantically pacing around the grass. "Mike, are you kidding me? That's why you're dragging us along with you, now that I know there are all these missing people out here. It just got me thinking. Maybe that's where he ended up." He replied, "Dude," I began, "hate to break it ya, but your dad was a drunk who went to the packy one day and never came back. I don't know where he is. But one thing I do know is, he sure as heck ain't out here." "What did you just say, Tyler?" Mike growled, his face growing red with anger, as he stormed over to me, but Jess jumped between us. "Hey, stop, fine. You know what? I don't need you guys. I'll find the rest of the bodies myself," Mike said defiantly, as he turned around and walked away. "But what about the mist? We only have one flashlight." I yelled out to him, "Keep it. I don't need it." He called back to us, without looking back. As he disappeared into the fog, Jess and I must have been walking in circles for a good 30 minutes, disoriented by the mist, before we finally got our bearings, and continued on our way back home. "It's just funny is all. Pack the CAH. Jess said, doing her best impression of a Boston accent, while careful not to trip in the grass. "That's your impression of me?" I asked, my boots splashing in the mud. "Yeah, is it wicked pissa, kid?" She answered playfully. "Good one," I replied. "Easy for you transplants to joke about our accents after you moved to our town, with your fancy homes, your fancy cars, and your Long Island accents." "Well, you know what? Maybe I find your accent funny too, do you now?" I paused for a moment. "Nah, it's cute," I replied. "Cute?" Jess asked. "Oh, I mean, totally not cute at all, I swear." She stopped and gave me a cheeky smile. "Tyler, are you flirting with me? No?" She took a step closer. "'Cause you know, out here in the marsh, surrounded by a sinister fog and all these dead corpses, might be an inappropriate time?" I interjected, my face beginning to blush. Jess leaned in even closer, her face just an inch from mine, and smiled. Romantic, as she was about to kiss me, I saw her close her eyes, but couldn't seem to close mine, completely in shock that this moment was finally happening. But just before her lips touched mine, I felt my boots sinking into the mud, and tilted my head down, leaving her hanging there, confused. "What's wrong?" Jess asked, opening her eyes, a look of disappointment washing over her face. We have a bit of a problem," I said, gesturing to the ground, where both of our legs were now almost completely submerged in the mud. "Oh no," Jess said, before attempting to pull herself out of the ground, and realizing that she was stuck. I followed suit, also to no avail. Then we looked at each other, and both began to laugh at the awkward situation we'd gotten ourselves into, until we continued to sink deeper and deeper into the mud. Jess' eyes suddenly turned from jovial to concerned, and she began yelling, "Help! Help!" I joined in, but after a few minutes of shouting, began to lose hope, accepting our inevitable demise, and the irony of 2 more bodies being added to the marshy graveyard. But just when the mud reached our necks, as we each shot each other one last look of affection, suddenly someone came stomping over, and ripped us out of the ground. "What on earth are you 2 kids doing out here at this hour?" our rescuer exclaimed, as he dropped us onto a more stable patch of grassy marshland a few feet away. He was an old man with a white beard, wearing a pair of rubber wading pants that were completely covered in mud. The serial killer, I thought to myself, before realizing that his voice sounded nothing like the tape's narrator, and that he could have easily killed us when we were stuck in the marsh, but didn't. "We got lost," I replied, careful not to offer up too much information. "Thanks for saving us," Jess added. "You 2 are lucky I was out here." "What were you doing out here?" I asked, suspicious of why someone, besides us, would be out here in the marsh so late at night. "Clammin'," he replied. "Clammin'?" Jess asked. "I'm a clammer. Ain't nothing in the world that brings me as much solace as searching for clams at night. But anyways, you 2 better be getting back. I saw the man out there earlier." "The man?" I asked. "Yes, the man in the marsh," he replied. "Who's that?" Jess added, us clammers and fishermen see him all the time, out there in the marsh. Always at night. And always digging away in the mud. Legend has it, he's the captain of that submerged boat out there. Forever trying to free it, Jess and I both looked at each other, our eyes wide with fear. Anyways, I'd better be getting back. Low tide's open us and there's clams to be clammed. You kids get home safe now, and like that, he was gone, disappearing into the fog like a ghost in the night, but Jess and I were much more concerned with what he told us than with the old man himself. We've got to find Mike. Jess said frantically, as she turned to me, a look of panic in her eyes. Are you serious? I replied. But we agreed to head back. Mike made his choice to stay, you heard the old man? There's someone else out there. We've got to save him, but I began to say, before Jess grabbed me by the collar and interrupted. No buts, Tyler. These tapes found their way to you, not us. They chose you. You were the one who was meant to get us into this mess, and you are the one who's meant to get us out of it. So please, for crying out loud, put on your big boy pants, turn around, and be a hero for once in your life. I didn't know whether to feel hurt or flattered. All I knew was that she was right. I'd never really had much of a purpose in life before finding the tapes. And in a weird way, they gave me one. So I dusted off the dried mud from my clothes, took Jess by the hand, and set off into the foggy marshland. When we finally arrived at the wreckage of the old boat, we found the nearby burial site completely excavated, the tape's third body protruding from the ground, and a box with what presumably was the next clue lying beside it, and not far away, just lying there in the grass, was Mike. Half alive, his body caught in an old bear trap, its rusty jaws clamping down into his torso, blood pouring out everywhere. I found the body. He mumbled to Jess and I as he noticed us approaching, blood dripping from his mouth. Mike. Jess screamed. As she started to run towards him, before I stopped her and crouched down to help him, but no matter how hard I tried, no matter how much force I put into it, the trap wouldn't release Mike from its grip. Eventually, I stood up and took a few steps back, knowing that my friend would soon die from his wounds, as my own blood is now pouring from my arm. Jess and I both knelt down by his side. I'm sorry for what I said. I whispered to him, as a tear rolled down my cheek. I'm sorry too. He replied, did someone do this to you? Jess asked. No. Mike replied. I had just found the body, but couldn't see well, and accidentally stepped in the trap. But then a little while later, I did see him. Who? Jess asked, the man from the tapes. He walked by and stood there for a minute, right where you were just standing. He looked at me for a moment, then just walked away and left me here to die, the man in the marsh. Jess said, tell me something, Tyler. Mike began, gesturing to the body. Is it him? Is it my dad? I sat there for a minute, not sure what to say, then moved the headphones from around my neck, switched tape 3/4 tape 4 and pressed play. Click. If you're listening to this, you found the third body. A widow, guilty of investing her entire life in that of another. Her husband, who, after sharing her life, her time, and her memories with, simply passed away one day. She should have known, as we've learned from the first two bodies, that love is not forever. And investing it, a fool's errand. When you're ready for the directions to the next bodies, switch to the fifth tape. Click. I looked at Mike as he lay there, dying in the grass, a hopeful look in his eye. It was him. It was your dad, Mike. I said, unable to tell him the truth, and hoping the lie would bring him some sense of closure, some sense of solace. In his final moments, he probably knew I was lying, but nevertheless. It brought a smile to his face. Thank you. He mumbled, before his eyes eventually closed, and he passed on from this life. Jess and I both began to cry our eyes out, as we sat there in the mud, our warm embrace counterpoint to the cold body that lay beside us. Maybe we should go back and get help. Jess said, sniffling, a sense of defeat in her voice. No, I replied, wiping the tears from my face. It's too late. We've got to keep going. We've got to find the bodies and make this guy pay for what he's done. Jess reached over and helped me wrap my plaid shirt around my arm in an effort to clot the wound. As I stared down at the ground, still processing what had just happened, Mike hated this shirt. I said, unable to stop myself from letting out a laugh. He really did. Jess replied, fighting a tearful chuckle of her own. That's when I remembered the wooden box that I'd seen earlier, its structure identical to the one we'd found by the first two bodies. I picked it up and opened it, revealing a piece of paper, with nothing but the letter A written on it, another letter. A. I said, J and A dot. Jess replied, what do you think it's spelling? I have no idea. Well, we'd better find the next one then, as the mist began to clear, and Jess looked out at the immense stretch of marshland that still lay before us. I switched tape 4 for tape 5 and pressed play, click. Story 2.
A long time ago, when I was a dumb as fuck missionary in Brazil, my companion and I were approached by a seemingly homeless man who greeted us in almost perfect English. Turns out, he was an American who had been living in Brazil for about 30 years. His name was Bickford. He had to have been in his late 50s to 60s. It was hard to tell because of his big beard and very unkempt appearance. He feigns interest in what we were peddling and asks for a copy of the Book of Mormon, but is clearly more excited to be speaking English with two Americans. We meet up with him a few times to discuss religion, but he would always meet us at the side of the road, or some other public but still secluded place. We had to give weekly reports to the ecclesiastical leader for the local unit about who we were meeting and teaching. After meeting Bickford a few times, we bring him up in our weekly meeting. The bishop and his other leaders instantly know who we are taking about and caution us to stay away from this guy. Apparently, he's a bit unstable, and once or twice a year will start bothering the missionaries. My companion and I can't believe that the bishop is referring to the same person, and we continue meeting with him. I don't know how to adequately describe the creepiness of this guy. Between his disheveled appearance, flat-out lying to us, and other small signs, he had a certain sinister vibe. But with nothing concrete to put our finger on, we continued to speak to him. Occasionally, he would run into us right outside of the house we lived in. One night, after talking about his house in the jungle and how nice and wonderful it was out there, he agrees to have us meet him at the side of the road in front of his house so he can guide us down the path to his house. The time arrives and we are waiting patiently by the side of the road, but Bickford is very late. Just as we are about to leave, he arrives and takes us down the path into the jungle. When we finally arrived at his house, my companion and I played it cool, but we couldn't believe what we were seeing. He had led us to a small clearing where there was a wooden cabin that had half collapsed on itself. He said, "Welcome home," and led us inside. There was no electricity, no running water, no utilities whatsoever. We walked in the front door frame, no door, and saw that all furniture in the house had been destroyed. Literally, someone had concentrated a large amount of effort and time to achieve this level of destruction. Chairs were unrecognizable, and there was trash everywhere. He begins showing us the main room inside the front door. That's when I noticed them. Notes, in chalk. On every square inch of the wooden walls, up the walls, on the ceiling, in a tiny frenzied scrawl. When I trained my light on the notes and started to read them, shit got real. Most of the notes were variations on, "Jesus will forgive me, but I have to stop. I did it again." These with a month and date written next to them. And the pièce de résistance, the names of several children, with their ages, and graphic sexual detail about them. We tried so hard to not mention the notes. We tried so hard to ask him small talk questions about the rotting food on the stove, or the 100 or so rats he kept in his basement. Anything but mentioning the notes. I can't speak for my companion, but I was freaking the fuck out. From glances at each other, I could see that he was at DEFCON 1 as well, and we decided to get the hell out of there. We made some excuse as it was getting late, that we needed to get home, and he reluctantly offered to show us the way back on the condition that we would come visit again. As we get out of the house, he suddenly remembers that he knows a shortcut and tells us to follow him. The direction he's trying to lead us is clearly not the way back to the road. It only led deeper into the jungle. We politely decline, and luckily we were able to follow the trail that we had originally made through the underbrush. This time, however, I did not give a shit about the spiders. When we got back onto the road and realized we were safe, we looked at each other, as if to say, did that really happen? Once we started talking about what we just saw, I was so terrified that I physically could not speak. Nothing like that had ever happened to me, nor since. I absolutely could not make a sound. I was so scared. My companion called our leaders, who called their leaders, and we ended up moving about a week later, but not before making an entry in our area book, the book that stays in the area listing who had been talked to and who to contact in the area, warning all other missionaries to stay away from this guy. I realize the entire ordeal sounds completely cliché. Everything about Bickford did. That's why after our second conversation with him, I started recording every time we would meet with my digital camera. I would set it on audio record mode and stick it in my pocket.
Story 3.
I freak out. I yell for my sister-in-law who walks into the hallway from the kitchen, and she sees it and freaks out. And she didn't even know that I had been coming home to it like that till after that happened, and I told her. Still not the freakiest part yet. I was home alone. During all this, we decided to get a pet pig so we can blame the stuff happening on him to ease our conscience. Well, we had baby gates up at both entrances to the living room to keep the pig from getting into everything in the house. So it was just me and the pig at home. Everyone was gone for the night, so I wanted to enjoy my night gaming. I'm playing with my friends, having a great night when I felt like I was being watched. So I turn around to see a girl pale white, not see-through. Long black hair, black eyes peeking around the door, way reaching for the baby gate to open it. It instantly dashed around the doorway. I screamed no to the top of my lungs. My friends freaking out through my headset. They thought I was being robbed. I told one to come over right now, and I stayed pinned against the TV watching both entrances to the living room until they got there. And the next day we saged the house, and I vowed to never play the Ouija board in my own house ever again. And if I ever did play it, I would sage myself and my house every time. And that was only some of the things that happened. There's a lot more that I left out, but putting them all would be way too much. But that's the gist of the story of how I stopped seeking the paranormal. So, I've always had weird things happen. I can't explain my whole life and have always believed in the paranormal. But what made me stop searching for the paranormal is something I wish to never experience again in my life. It wouldn't have been as bad if it wasn't in my own house. That me, my wife, sister-in-law and son all live in. But back to the story, I bought an Ouija board and started playing with it. We had several paranormal things go on in the house beforehand, but it only got worse with the use of the Ouija board. A few noises, things moving around the house, cups would be thrown from flat surfaces with no one near it. My son one time even walked to a corner in the bathroom by the washing machine back when he couldn't talk and just started reaching for people and started reaching for someone in the corner. I picked him up and ran out of the room. Keep in mind, that was before the Ouija board. Then I started playing with the Ouija board, and every time I would talk to a ghost named Dell, well, I got curious. Looked up on my state's death records. I found a girl, died of a car crash in the same county I lived in, named Delcy Ray. As I typed this, my lights flickered. I haven't experienced anything since I've saged the house after the story I'm about to tell you. All the information Dell gave me matched up with this girl, except she said she was 6 and the girl was 9. Which may make sense if she was sitting on the opposite side of the Ouija board. A 6 would look like a 9 to a kid. But this isn't the part that freaked me out to no end. Objects would move from one side of the room to the other when I would turn my back. We had a little chair on our front porch that would sit up next to the house facing towards the road. It was a kid chair for my son. Some days I would come home and this chair would be sitting face the door to our house. I didn't think nothing of it because my in-laws were in and out of the house all the time. No problem. I would just love it back. Well, one day, it was just me and my sister-in-law at home. I had just got home 30 minutes prior to this happening. The chair was in the spot it was supposed to be. I was in our living room walking towards the hallway, and I was about 2 feet from the window the chair normally sits in front of. I hear a noise on the porch. I look outside, I see no one. Keep in mind, the door is only about 7 to 8 feet from this window. I run to the door, I open it, and the chair is sitting facing towards the door.
Story 4. I'm going to first say this was my personal narrative for my English 3 class final, so at the end of course there is moral reflection and formal introduction. But I thought I would share it because it has some horror aspects to it. I've always been fascinated with the mind, how it works, and everything like that, but the thing that has intrigued me the most is dreams. How can something so small create a whole different reality within itself? I honestly don't know the answer. I feel that the dreams I had as a child were so peculiar. Now, you could say that as time moved on, my memories could have slowly faded, but there will always be one dream that truly sat with me, a nightmare. I was only about 7 years old at the time. We had just moved into our new house, and I was still getting used to everything. It was night, and my parents got me ready and brought me to bed. My mother, as always, tucked me into bed and kissed me softly on the forehead, sending me off to a good night's sleep. As my mom left, she turned off the lights and left my door open a crack. I turned over to my right side, the side that I usually sleep on, closed my eyes, and went to bed. As a child, I had these recurring dreams in which I felt trapped. It's hard to explain, but it was almost the feeling of having no control over what was happening, and still to this day, my head seems to hurt from the fear or whatever feeling I was experiencing. As you may have guessed, the night began with that dream, and I remember myself waking up. My room was dark, and I started to cry and yell for my parents. They urgently rushed into my room and told me that what I had was just a dream. Once they left, I once again fell asleep. This part of the story is a little fuzzy, but I do remember, in my new dream, playing basketball with my friends. This went on for what felt like an hour or so, and then I woke up again. Or at least I thought. As I got older, I learned about lucid dreams and false awakenings, events in which you think you woke up but are truly still asleep. It turns out that night I had a false awakening, but not a good one. My room was dark, more dark than usual, and there was a soft humming coming from the hallways. Through the crack of my door, I could see what I can only describe as a ghostly glow surrounded by fog. As I looked around my room, I felt a sense of loneliness. I felt like there was nothing I could do. I felt trapped. My heart was beating, I could feel it beating out of my chest. My breathing got heavy, and all I could feel was a cold, spine-tingling rush of fear. At this point, I still thought I was really awake, everything felt so real, and I could even feel the brush of my sheets as I lay there. What else could I think of? I started yelling, "Mom! Dad!" but my voice felt like it had disappeared. I stopped yelling, and it went quiet. I started to hear slow steps coming from the carpeted hallway floor. I thought to myself everything was okay, I had got my parents' attention, everything was fine. That was far from the truth. The door of my room opened slowly, and what looked like my mom and dad stepped in. The odd thing, though, was that these were not my parents. The two beings sported a white mask with a drawn-on face. I was frozen, I couldn't move. The two beings just stood there, staring at me. My heart was beating faster now, and I started to hyperventilate. One of them raised their hand, and in it was a tan vase. I blinked, and as I opened my eyes, the being with the vase was standing over my bed, still holding it in a position that seemed like it was getting ready to smash it. I lay there in my bed, shocked with fear. There was a voice, almost a whisper, in my ear. It whispered one simple word. Dream. As soon as that word was spoken into my ear, I woke up. My heart was still beating, but a ray of sunshine breached my window, beaming onto my face. While lying in bed, I turned to the door where my dream had occurred. I smiled, just happy that it was finally over. Once again, dreams are important, even if we don't understand them, they all have meaning. I feel like this happened to show me how people can change and how to avoid the bad in people. Story 5. This is the story of how my dad was taken away. Although I continued to visit him, from time to time, and I can say he even seemed to find some sort of peace, he was never released, and at the end of each visit, he would always grip my hands, tell me to watch out for the giant moose. Every time, even though so many years have passed since that summer when we first saw the giant moose, my family, Mom, Dad, and Robbie and I had first seen the giant injured moose a few weeks before Dad's final breakdown, when we visited a wildlife park in our region. We had wandered round the grassy enclosures, looking at the animals, nothing especially exotic, beavers and otters and deer and a couple of wolves. As I recall, lying back from the wired fences and watching us indolently through their sharp yellow eyes. Birds, 2 eagles and hawks and others with bright feathers, flitting around their large dome-shaped cages. Peacocks wandered freely on the narrow open trails. The wounded giant moose was not in an open enclosure. It was housed in a small shed, and a notice by the door alerted visitors that the moose was injured and receiving veterinary treatment. There was a sharp, horrible smell hanging around the hut, and flies buzzed around us. We had all peered in on the moose through the small window. Their smell was sharper, and at first it looked completely dark inside the shed. Dad had picked me up and held me close to the window so I could get a better look. Despite the dark, I could see the wound in his neck quite clearly. The gaping sides of the wound quivered, in time with the moose's heavy, labored breathing. We wondered how the injury happened. The moose turned his head and looked directly into my eyes. The smell and the sight of blood made me feel queasy, and I looked back at Dad and asked him to put me back down. He laughed, told me not to be such a wuss, held me up higher and gripped me tighter. I started screaming and squirming, begging him to put me down. Mom had murmured, "Oh, put her down, will you?" and then started wandering away, pushing Robbie, who was still in a pushchair in those days. Finally Dad put me down, and we followed Mom and Robbie, Dad still laughing at my silliness over the moose. We all got into the car to leave. Before the car moved, the giant moose with the wounded neck suddenly appeared out of nowhere by the car and brought its massive head down and peered in at us through the car window. It happened so quickly that I was startled. Dad swore loudly and swerved off. Mom didn't tell him off as she usually would for swearing. When we got home, the moose was already in the garden, peering in through our windows, the blood from its injury gleaming red in the late afternoon sun. "What the actual fuck?" yelled Dad. "I'm going to call the police." "Wait a minute," said Mom, who had already pulled out her mobile. "Everybody stay in the car." Mom called the park and asked about the moose, carefully avoiding saying it was in our garden. I remember that clearly. The park person told her the moose had died earlier that day, just about the time we would have been leaving the park. So Dad didn't call the police, and the moose just stood there in our garden, looking in on us through our windows. Nobody else could see him, just us. None of the neighbors, no one. We realized that from the beginning. None of us even bothered asking. He was always there, just for us. He was silent, only moving his wounded bloody neck to lower or raise his giant antlered head, sometimes looking through the ground floor windows, sometimes craning his neck high to look through the first floor windows. It didn't matter if we drew the curtains, he'd still be there, trying to peer through. He didn't hurt us, but was always there watching us. When we left the house to go out, he would turn to watch us leave, and then stand there silently on our return, watching us enter. Only Robbie didn't really mind him, although I knew he could see him. It must have been only a few weeks later. Summer was over, but the weather was still warm. We had not really gotten used to the moose, but it was clear Dad didn't like it when we talked about him, so we didn't. I glanced outside my bedroom window. The giant moose was there as always in the garden, bent down, looking into the living room window. Mom and Robbie must have been there. That must be why he was looking in on them. If the living room had been empty, I knew he would be at my window, his neck craned high and staring right in at me. I would see the gaping open wound on his neck close up. The details of blood and sinewy muscle fresh and clear in the early afternoon sun. Even from the distance of the bedroom window, I could still see the wound. I tried to concentrate on my homework. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, followed by the sound of shattering glass and Mom's scream. Even though I knew I shouldn't, I ran to the window. I couldn't help it. Dad was firing at the giant moose, who stood there immobile as always and continued looking in through the window, undisturbed. Mom was screaming my name. I ran under the bed, and the gunshots continued. Eventually, after a very long time, the police came and took Dad away. Mom had only been slightly injured from the shattered glass. It was clear Dad hadn't been aiming at her or Robbie. Mom and Robbie and I moved to a new high-rise close to the city center, with no garden. We never saw the moose again. Story 6. I never thought my quiet hometown harbored such dark secrets until the day I stumbled upon the truth. It began innocently enough, but it soon escalated into an absolute nightmare, with widespread rumors of a shady cult headed by a group of women in my small hometown and strange occurrences of people disappearing mysteriously. It all started when my mother began acting strangely. She became distant, spending hours locked in her room, whispering to someone on the phone in hushed tones. At night, I could hear her chanting strange incantations, her voice echoing through the house like a sinister melody. I tried to brush it off as stress or overwork, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. And then, one fateful night, I made a discovery that would change everything. I followed my mother into the woods behind our house, curious about where she disappeared to every night. As I crept through the trees, I stumbled upon a clearing bathed in moonlight. There, in the center of the clearing, stood a group of cloaked figures, their faces obscured by shadow. I watched in horror as my mother stepped forward, joining the circle of these people. There was a naked man whose face was covered with black polythene in the center and his limbs were tied with a rope. Two women wearing black clothes with their faces completely covered came and started beating the man with a belt. Everybody took their turns to beat him up. Then they started making small cuts on the body of the man. Again, everybody took their turns to make cuts on him. They smashed a wine bottle on his chest. I was standing there witnessing all these from my very own eyes. I couldn't believe the horrifying things happening in front of my eyes. They began chanting something, their voices rising and falling in an eerie cadence. I couldn't make out the words, but their meaning was clear. Something dark and sinister was happening in front of me, and my mother was at the center of it all. Terrified, I fled back to the safety of our home, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me like a shroud. I knew I had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. I remembered reading a similar description of the incident last night in some book at my library. I don't exactly remember the name of the book, but I remembered bits of print and other small details. I started looking for the book at the library. Over the next few weeks, I delved deeper into the secrets of my mom and those mysterious people, piecing together fragments of information from the book. A cult named Zood used to exist during the 1980s, led by Mayana, who used to kidnap people to perform their rituals. The description of the ritual was identical to what I witnessed after I followed my mother that night. One day Mayana suddenly disappeared and nobody found her dead body, but after that, these things stopped happening. I started searching for the original author of this book. I searched for the author. This book was written by Mrs. Martha Anna Marie in 1995 and was originally published in 1996. The copy of the book I borrowed from the library was just 5 years old. Unfortunately, I was unable to contact the author directly, but I contacted the publication regarding the author of the book. They gave that information already available online. Apart from that, they also gave me her outdated landline number. A day later, my mother called me for dinner when I was reading that book. I kept the book on my bed and went for dinner. After I returned, the book was nowhere to be found. After my mother left the house to go shopping, I rummaged around her room in search of more evidence. I came across the book I borrowed from the library along with a big rusty book with the same copper symbol mentioned in the book written by Mrs. Martha. As mentioned in the book by Mrs. Martha, I was unable to open that book without the key. This converted my doubt into belief. The fact, my mother took the book from my room and kept it in her cupboard. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized that I was in danger. The cultists knew I was onto them. To protect their secrets, they can go to any extent. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the sound of footsteps outside my window. I peered through the curtains to see a group of cloaked figures standing in the moonlight, their eyes fixed on my house. Panic surged through me as I realized they had come for me. I fled into the darkness, racing through the streets as they pursued me with relentless determination. I knew I had to find a way to stop them, to expose their evil deeds to the world. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and dialed the only person I could trust. As I waited for help to arrive, I huddled in the shadows, praying that I would survive the night. And as the first light of dawn broke through the darkness, I fainted that night and woke up in a hospital. Later I came to know that my mother was gone and nowhere to be found. I knew that the nightmare was finally over, or I may be wrong. It was my fault that I didn't expose them to the world. The memory of that dark day still haunts me, a reminder to trust no one, not even your family members. And though I may never fully understand the true extent of my mother's involvement in the cult or those shady activities, I loved my mom and still miss her. Police is in her search. I don't know where she is or what she is doing. I don't even know if she is alive or not. I wish she was never involved in these things. At the same time, I felt relief that I no longer have to live with sketchy human being like her. I am feeling of relief and sadness at the same time. But some nights, when the wind whispers through the trees and the shadows dance across my window, I can't help but wonder if the cult is truly gone, or if its dark legacy still lingers, waiting to ensnare its next victim or even me.